Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming back. And now we have the younger members of our profession giving us a bit of insights as to what stage they're at in their career, how they got there, and where they think they might be going. First one is Associate Professor Phil Britton. Welcome, Phil. Phil is a paediatrician with an infectious disease background. He works at the Children's Hospital at Westmead. He's an Associate Professor in Child and Adolescent Health with the University of Sydney, and he's an early mid-career clinician researcher. His expertise and interest is surveillance of severe childhood infectious diseases, with a particular focus on neurological and respiratory infections. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Associate Professor Ramanathan, who is a neurologist and a clinician-scientist with a subspecialty focus in neuroimmunology. She's also a staff neurologist at Concord Hospital. Her research program aims to improve understanding of underlying disease pathogenesis with a focus on precision medicine, a new specialty, with diagnosis and therapeutics. So welcome, Darshi. And our final speaker is Dr. Susic, is that how I pronounce it? A clinical academic obstetrician and gynaecologist at Liverpool Hospital. She's a senior lecturer with the University of New South Wales. She teaches undergraduate, postgraduate and pre-vocational students and doctors for UNSW and the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists. She fosters national and international research collaborations to ensure the ongoing discovery of information pertaining to women's health, with a focus on the improvement of women's health outcomes more broadly. So, welcome. So we've got a couple of questions for the panel today, and then we'll have some time at the end for you to ask your questions of them. So I might just ask by asking each of you, and perhaps we'll start at the other end, Danny.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what your clinical and research journey has been so far? And for any of you who want some more information, their bios are available online. So, Danny.
Thank you, and thank you for being asked to come and speak today. I am the baby of the group, I feel, because I'm the only person on the schedule with no A prof or prof in front of my name. So I'm at the beginning of my research journey, and I've just completed my PhD in the microbiome during pregnancy and its impact on adverse pregnancy outcomes, including hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, gestational diabetes, and excessive gestational weight gain. And we were just having a really nice conversation in the foyer as I've met these two beautiful people about how this has come about and how an obstetrician becomes an academic, because we're quite rare. And we were talking about the difference between physician training versus surgical training and how we integrate research with those specialties. So I broke the mold a little bit and pushed my college to allow me to integrate my PhD into my final 2 years of my fellowship. That's never been done before. It made everyone's hair grey, including my own, but eventually we kind of came to a negotiation about how we balance surgical training, because it's a very procedural, skill-based specialty, as you can imagine, and academic work. And since that time, we now have a pre-vocational training pathway for our fellowships to have PhDs and academics kind of encouraged into our specialty. So I was a bit of a pioneer in that sense. My PhD journey started with a conversation around the fact that obstetrics is really crappy hours, and that I'd like you to be home more with your kid, okay, which then kind of started this whole process. I have a 9-year-old, she's the light of my life, so I'm a mum as well. I was married at the time that this journey started, and then a year into my PhD, my husband said, I don't think I need to be a dad anymore. So I've gone academic, research, fellowship, divorce, single mum, and the whole get up. So I feel very well spaced to tell you how hard it is to do it all, essentially on your own, and in a specialty, in a field where everyone said, you're so good at your clinical job, only the bad clinicians do research. And trying to marry that, I was like, hang on a second, I can still be good at my job and do research, can I not? And so lots of people in my specialty who do research actually drop their clinical duties because they don't feel like they're skilled enough to continue to offer cutting edge clinical work at 3 o'clock in the morning. My PhD journey was studying the microbiome, as I said before, and I did a prospective cohort study of 100 women during their pregnancies, but it included a time point of birth. And at the end of my PhD, when I was bloody exhausted, I looked at the fact that 65% of my cohort delivered between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m, and I was present for all of their births, as well as doing all of my clinical work and being a mum. So I guess I felt like I was a little bit of a different beast. I currently help head up the institute at the Ingham Institute, so I work with Professor Elliott out there. We're doing some microbiome work. We do work with some of our international collaborators, and I've got collaborators in Melbourne, in Adelaide, and in Perth. The field of the microbiome, as you all know, sexy hot topic at the time. When I was asked to do a PhD in that area, I had to quickly Google what the hell it was. And then I learned really quickly actually what it was. Lots of bugs, lots of bioinformatics. So I guess it's been a tortuous journey from a personal perspective, and the journey in academia is rife with ego and challenges, and I'm someone who lives from my heart and has maintained my values, and I think that's the biggest thing to do in a world where you feel like you're the imposter or the underdog or the little person doing things a little bit differently. So I think just knowing who you are as an individual helps drive that process, but I'll leave it there.
Well, it sounds like a very exciting start to your career.
It's smooth from here, right?
But we definitely need academic obstetricians and gynecologists. Darshi, would you like to tell us a little bit about where you're at and where you've come from?
Sure. So I'm a neurologist. I'm primarily an adult neurologist. I was always interested in neurology. I read a number of books by Oliver Sacks when I was a teenager, and I thought, this is fantastic, I want to do this. And I also lived internationally for a lot of my childhood. My father was an academic with the United Nations, and I remember being a very significant memory for me. We lived for about 8 years in Thailand at the time. It was during the AIDS epidemic, and you know, the devastation of that in the country that I was living in, and the emergence of highly active antiretroviral therapy and the difference it made in a condition that's primarily a death sentence to something that you can live with. And so when I started medicine, I was always thinking about neurology and immunology and what this might look like and which of the two I was going to do. And I decided to go down the path of neurology, and when I was an intern, it was actually an amazing time to be around for my two interests, because 2005, 2006 was the time when it first became realised that a number of currently undiagnosed neurological conditions actually have an autoimmune basis. And there's a lot of nihilism with neurology. Everything's thought to be neurodegenerative, everything's thought to be untreatable, but what was identified at the time was the first presentation of something that was previously misdiagnosed as a viral encephalitis or an infectious cause, treated with antivirals. These patients did terribly, they often died. And what we now know is that it was a subtype of autoimmune encephalitis. And there are now about 30 syndromes. None of these conditions are new, they've been there forever. But these patients were misdiagnosed as infectious causes or multiple sclerosis or something else. So this was really the birth of that kind of sub-discipline. And when I was an intern, our neurology team looked after the first patient in Australia to be diagnosed with this. And it was so exciting. And I just thought, look, I found my place. This is what I need to do. So I got through my neurology training, my general medical and neurology subspecialty training. I think like Sarah, I did my final year of my training as the first year of my PhD. And I told myself, look, if you're going to be serious about this, you need to understand the method sections of the papers you're reading, and the only way you can do that is by doing a PhD. That's a basic science PhD. And I was incredibly lucky to have a really wonderful supervisory team that I think we might come into talks about mentorship later in this conversation. But that PhD really encapsulated for me what I really enjoyed about this marriage of the clinical and the basic science. When I finished my PhD, in the last year of my PhD, I was awarded an HMRC Early Career Fellowship, which allowed me to spend 2.5 years overseas and then some time back here. And I went to the University of Oxford because that was a centre that was really the centre of excellence. There were about 2 centres of excellence in the world, One was Mayo and one was Oxford for this particular field. And I just had an amazing experience there. I learnt lots of new scientific techniques, and just to work in an environment like that was truly a gift. And those collaborations, that mentorship from that period. Coming back here and having about 1.5 years left on my fellowship to try and figure out how I'm going to navigate research independence was a interesting time. Forgot to mention I had twins during my PhD, so just as a side note. So I'd done 2 years of my PhD full-time, and then I had my twins, so I finished the last 1.5 years of my PhD part-time. So we took our little bubbers to England with us when they were 3 years old. They came back at the age of 5 sounding like little British women, so based on the nursery carers. It was really, really amusing. But when we came back here, I think the big challenge was actually trying to navigate research independence and applying for 9 fellowships, and I was lucky I got the one I wanted, which was an investigator grant from an HMRC, but that was what really helped me set up developing my own lab, starting my own team, but very closely being mentored and supported by my PhD supervisors, my postdoc supervisor, and I think what was interesting was my international collaborations were very organically, very quickly growing, and what I had to do was kind of develop the more national aspects of it. Because I work in rare disease, I started a study group during my PhD that I have led since, and so expanding that internationally has been really helpful. In rare disease, trying to use collaborations and multi-sensor data to definitively answer questions is really important. You can never do it in just one centre. So that's been my process, and I think one of both the challenge and the joy has been maintaining that basic science understanding of what is the pathogenesis of these disorders, how do we target our treatment in a way that isn't ablating people's entire immune systems, using a blunt hammer approach, and how do we identify certain conditions, and do we need complement inhibitors here? Do we need B-cell depletion? Do we need something else? Is T-cells that work? So that's been the really wonderful basic science aspect of it. And then improving diagnostic and clinical guidelines in these conditions, and also always being mindful that we live in a very privileged healthcare system, and how is the research that we put out going to actually work on a global level, and trying to maintain that degree of equity and availability of what we say is required for diagnosis and treatment.
Thanks, Darshi. So Phil, your clinical and research career so far?
Yeah, look, I would say much more uninspiring and much more pragmatic is the truth. My father's an academic and researcher, and so I grew up, I guess, with that, and my response was, that's the last thing I want to do, never want to do a PhD. But I got to the end of my clinical training in infectious diseases and really was planning to go overseas and work in a low and middle income country. That's what I wanted to do. But my wife and I had our 3rd child at the time, and it was going to be bad for my marriage to take my wife overseas with 3 kids under 5. So then it was, what am I going to do with my life? And actually it was Cheryl Jones, who's now the Dean of Medicine here at UNSW, who said, I've got this project that I'd like to get off the ground, haven't been able to get it off the ground. I can fund you for 6 months, and then you've got to get your own funding. And the truth is that was the best job offer for me at the time. And so I took it and made it work. I got to the end of my PhD, and unlike, the typical career pattern, go and do a postdoc somewhere else, you have to go somewhere else. It has to be somewhere impressive. Again, my family was not in a position to move, so I just made it work where I could, and I guess I've never really done a postdoc, actually, is the truth. I just kept doing my own research and made it work. I was very fortunate in the location that I was at, that there were people who were willing to mentor and support that and encourage that. So, and then I got to the end of kind of doing postdoctoral research, working part-time as a clinician, part-time as a teaching academic, actually, at the University of Sydney. And the hospital there was a position that opened up for a staff specialist, a full-time staff specialist. So I'm actually a full-time clinical person trying to keep research going on the side because I'm interested in it. I think it's important. And then again, another pragmatic decision. I had senior colleagues who retired in the last couple of years, and somebody needed to be the head of department, so I'm now the head of a hospital department of infectious disease and microbiology. So it's very uninspiring because none of my decisions have been driven by a deep passion for something, except for the fact that I really do think we all have a contribution to make for the common good and for the people that we serve, and taking every opportunity to do the best for that outcome. And for me, that's been clinical work and research and always asking questions and being interested in new ideas. And that's why I still do research, is it's incredibly interesting, really, and brings a lot of interesting things into clinical practice.
So I think Phil undersells himself a little bit. You know, he is running a national paediatric surveillance system, and he's, as he said, now head of a clinical department. But I think you do raise an interesting point that we've all got to advocate to our clinical departments for protected time for research, and certainly within our hospital. There are some groups that say, okay, Monday's your day, or Monday and Tuesday. We have the capacity to negotiate that, so I think it's difficult, but as a clinician, we need to continue to do that. So, Phil, I'll start with you this time. As a health professional, was there a particular catalyst that got you involved in research? You've sort of touched on it, but...
Yeah, well, the catalyst was I didn't have a job, really. That was the catalyst. Yeah, I had a mortgage and 3 kids under 5, so... and this was the best offer. Having said that, you know, again, my father was an academic. I grew up with, I guess, a certain style of thinking about the world, which was, you know, don't accept received wisdom, ask questions, think about alternative explanations. And that's really what underlies research, isn't it? Is there a better way? Do we really understand this? Can we come up with a new way of thinking? And that's temperamentally my approach, and that's great for research, right? So, and it drives you to do research because you're asking your own questions and you want them answered. So that's probably the catalyst, a little bit of pragmatism, a little bit of temperament, and then research is addictive. I think everybody would. It's addictive in the sense that when you do generate even a very small little bit of new knowledge, that's something that's really quite exciting and becomes then its own self-fulfilling and momentum-generating kind of process.
And I think as a clinician even more when you see it appearing in clinical guidelines or in policy documents. So Darshi, was there a particular catalyst that sort of prompted you to pursue research?
I mean, I think I mentioned it a little bit earlier, which was the background, my childhood, my father's kind of interest. I could see he enjoys his career. It looked like, you know, it's not been in health, it's been in economics, but he's always had a very fulfilling career, and I thought that seems like a good thing. I think for me, that one patient was a real game changer for me because it happened. We went to a conference, they presented a case, we thought, my goodness, this is this girl sitting in ICU at the moment. We came back, we did the required investigations, it was all there. And she was so disabled. She was a 17-year-old girl who'd been in ICU, she'd been floating around a psychiatry ward for 7 months. And, you know, it took her a really long time to come out of ICU. It took about a year at the end of it, but she had a long recovery. 2-3 years later, she was in university doing a teaching degree. And I think for me, these are children and these are young adults and older adults. It doesn't, it's across the whole age span, and it makes an immense difference. So I think for me, it was that there is something that if you do it right, if you recognise it, if you treat it right, these patients have a good quality of life. That's been really interesting for me. And I think the other thing that kept my interest in research is I found my PhD just a completely life-changing experience, and I knew I just wanted more of that. And I think it was a combination of the people I was working with, the culture I was in, the joy of finding something new, describing a condition, describing the pathogenesis of a condition. And then what has been really wonderful has been, I think the previous 3 talks all mentioned about how do you change policy, how do you change practice. And, you know, our research assay in the lab is now NATA accredited with a national centre for these assays in collaboration with the scientists and the clinicians we work for. We know why it's important clinically. Our papers have enabled approval of treatment through Medicare for patients that they would otherwise not be approved for. We've been able to develop national and international guidelines that have been adopted around the world. So I think it's that kind of, it is addictive, as Phil says, you know, you find something, you think about it, you recognise a syndrome and you said, these patients look similar, let's figure it out. And then in the end, 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, you know, there are patient support groups for a condition that was unknown when you started your PhD, and I think that's just amazing to be able to give that answer. So for me, it's just been also the process of interdisciplinary research I found extremely exciting. So I think had I only done clinical neurology, I would have stayed in a particular field, but because when you're doing research and you go the borderlines of different disciplines, working with ophthalmologists, working with radiologists, working with engineers, basic scientists, and I think you end up thinking in very different ways because of the insights that people from cross-disciplinary work bring to your work, and I think that's been a very strong and compelling reason to continue research for me. You think very differently to how you would were you not in research.
Thanks. And just to pick up, both of you have highlighted the importance of your family in influencing your career, and that's something for you younger colleagues to be thinking about. We all have an influence on what our children and nieces and nephews and other young people in our lives will do. Danny, was there a particular catalyst that sparked your interest in research?
I suppose, reflecting on what you've both said, I didn't have that mentor in my parents. I'm the first person in my family to go to university. So my mum was very proud when I walked across the stage with my PhD, as was my daughter. And I think in obstetrics and gynaecology, there's not a lot of research funding. So it's not sexy, it's not cancer, it's not obesity, it's not a lifestyle disease, which seems to get a lot more of the funding. What's that? Well, it's not cancer, let's put it that way. All the grants seem to go to cancer. And so I found that really frustrating because we have conditions that only exist in the pregnant state when there's a placenta inside a woman. And these conditions are really hard to tackle, and the pathophysiology of those conditions are not understood. And so there's a couple of groups in Australia, particularly the group out at the Mercy in Melbourne, that do a lot of these kind of interventional translational attempts to study preeclampsia prevention, for example. But I find that it's just one of those really challenging areas, and from at the coalface treating women, where we haven't changed the incidence of these conditions around the world forever, or for many years, really drove me to think, actually, is there another way of looking at a disease process? And I guess the microbiome was the sexy topic at the time. It still is. It's bloody hard to study, like so many confounders, and what does this little bug do, and is that important, and is it not important? And so I guess I was expecting, okay, I had 2 PhD supervisors at the beginning of my journey, which turned into 3, which turned into none, which turned into 2 more. So that's been a journey. But one believed in the microbiome, one didn't believe in the microbiome, so I was kind of navigating the middle path. And when we had results that actually showed association, I was like, damn, now I've got stuff to write about. So that made really chunky research results chapters. But then you're sparked into causation. So you're like, okay, association, what does it mean? And then it's causation, and then you get the bug, and then you're like, actually, I do want to know more about this, and you keep diving into the data. And then you're working with the beautiful scientists to do translational research models. So I think it does perpetuate itself, but you can do this without the person in your family that has done it before you, and you can forge your own path, is, I guess, my message.
Thanks. Just to pick up on the point you made about funding, I work in a very niche area at the moment, which is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, but we used our research to advocate to government through inquiries and development of national strategies, and that has resulted in a lot of targeted calls for research from NHMRC, for example, and funding from government. So any of you working in areas which you think are neglected, and we all think our area is neglected, do remember that your research and advocacy can provide access to funding. Okay, so Phil, back to you. Looking at your research journey so far, is there anything apart from divorcing your wife that you
Which I'm not going to do. That's an absolute commitment, yeah.
So you've mentioned that, you know, there are a number of compromises you had to make, but is there anything you would do differently even within the context of what you've done?
So two things I think I would do differently. One is if you're embarking on a PhD, which the reality is that is the entry into academic research for the vast majority of people who are going to stay in it. Focus on skill development, and I supervise PhDs now, so I know that there's a natural tension between the PhD supervisor who's trying to often get a project done and get something finished, and the PhD student who is really trying to develop, hopefully, their own independent trajectory. And I think sometimes that tension can play out that you end up doing the supervisor's work, and I was naive to that, I think, at the time, until very much at the back end of my PhD. So I think I underdid skill development. So I say to all PhD students who ever ask me, focus on skills and focus on transferable skills. Don't obsess about the topic during your PhD. The postdoc has to be all about the area of research and the trajectory into an area, but the PhD should really be about your skill development and negotiating that with your supervisor so that you're not just doing their projects is a critical thing. So that's one of the things that is it a regret? Maybe a regret. You're not supposed to regret anything these days, but maybe I could have done better. The other thing that I think I could do better, still could do better, is, you pointed it out before. You really, going into research is like going into running a small business. You do have to be your own best advocate. You do have to tell your own best story. I find that nauseating, I must admit. But it's the truth. So trying to figure out what is your best story and trying to distill that into its purest form and then communicate that is something I don't do very well, and I'd encourage you to try to do better. These guys are really good at it, so listen to them.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I think a lot of the universities now insist on mandatory training as part of PhD, which is something that's certainly changed over the years. So do take those opportunities. Darshi, is there anything you would have done differently?
I'm trying to think what it is, and I think I don't think I would have done anything differently per se, but that's because I was very lucky that at a point where I was very much going to do something that I'm certain I would currently regret, I had better advice from wiser people, and I think I made the right choice. And I think that is an essential tension in clinical research, and I think it is that when you finish your PhD and you're not yet established yourself as a clinician and you've not yet established yourself as a researcher, there are a lot of people who will give you lots of advice. And I think one of those things is you feel this real need to establish your clinical career and to take on a lot and to be very secure in your clinical identity. And I think that is a quick fix and makes you feel better. But I actually think the clinical career is much more forgiving than a research career. And I think that in those early career years, there is not, if you are serious about a future in research, that you are well placed to try and make sure you position yourself carefully for the research side of things, because the clinical aspects of it, there will always be a lot of clinical work. And so for me, it was trying to be really careful about how to do the clinical work which I love doing. It's not that I find clinical work a problem at all. It's genuinely the best part of my week. But it was saying, okay, look, I'm going to subspecialise in neuroimmunology. Let me do neuroimmunology specific clinical work. Let me hold a discomfort of the lack of certainty about my research future, the fact that my funding's going to run out in X months, the fact that I'm going to apply for something that's got a 6% success rate. I have to live with that, but for the period that I have current funding, I'm going to give my research career absolutely everything I've got. I'm going to keep my clinical skills going in the area I want to be in. And that's a decision I made, but there were multiple points at the time where you offered, here's a 0.5 FTE staff specialist, come and take over this clinic, we really need you, we can give you a full-time staff specialist appointment, we can give you these different appointments. And I think for me, the tricky thing was it comes from people who you value their opinion greatly. They've been your clinical mentors for a decade. They're people who want the best for you. They think this is the best thing for you. And so that's where it becomes really difficult. So I think taking objective advice from people, taking advice from research-focused clinical people is quite different from a clinical-focused research person. And I think both these are equally important. They're important identities, and I think you can find both equally fulfilling. And I think the important one is figuring out which camp you're in. So I think I'm probably more in the research-focused camp with clinical involvement than the clinical-focused camp with research involvement. But I think that these are very mutually beneficial camps. And I think I was almost 90% ready to commit to a job that I think would have meant that I would have not continued my research career to the way I wanted. So I have one mentor in particular to thank for saying, sit down and think about this. This can be present in 2 years if you want it. Is this what you want to do right now? So I didn't regret that choice, but I almost could have.
Thanks. So Danny, is there anything you would have done differently?
Look, I think I completely agree with what you've just said, and you mentioned the word camp. I think find the people you want to camp out with. I think that's really important. Like, understand who the people are in your group. I mean, my motto now is only kind people with good hearts is all the only research people I'm going to try and surround myself with. You can't always pick that. But I think if you can be mentored by the people that you can completely trust, and you know, I'm probably more the clinician who dabbles in research, and you can't really do that, so I'm finding my feet now in that space. Because research, and I'm an education-focused senior lecturer, so I'm not on a mixed-track pathway. So research for me, from a university's KPI perspective, is about educational research. So I do a lot of that now in the undergraduate space, but that's a huge pivot to the pipette and microbiome and DNA extraction that I've now become accustomed to and am passionate about. So it's about making those decisions with a lot of thought process, but also leading with your heart a little bit to actually, I'm going to just feel my way through this big decision point in my life, and who are the people that I'm going to set up camp with to help me over the next 5, 10 years, rest of my career.
Great, thanks. So Phil, what would you say is the best bit of your current career?
Yeah, well, the best bit of my career is, unlike Danny, who says she's in a clinical discipline that's a bit adverse to research, that's very challenging. I'm in a clinical specialty that is very academically orientated, which is a great benefit to me because I get to have my cake and eat it too. I get to teach people, supervise people, do my own research, do clinical work. And sometimes I think to myself, somebody's going to figure this out and not want to pay me anymore, right? So I'm very lucky. I'm a bit of a jack of all trades. I have lots of interests, and I've landed in a job where I can usually maintain most of them.
Or infectious diseases has been a good choice.
Yeah, it's the best. So I don't know what you're planning to do in life, but certainly do infectious disease. It's much more interesting than any of these other disciplines.
Okay, you can search around for the best offers at lunchtime. Darshi, what would you say is the best part of your current career?
I think this, the name of this symposium is Life as a Clinician-Scientist, and I think for me, that's it. It's do my clinics, find all the challenges, all the things that I don't know how to sort out yet, or national or international people don't know how to sort out yet. And I guess that really helps you define what is the unmet need, what are you going to spend time and money and effort and other people's involvement doing, being able to do that research, and then having outcomes that changes the way that you do things in your clinic and to your patients, but also more nationally, more globally. I think that kind of back and forth is an incredible privilege that I think we're very lucky to have. The other best things about the research is I think it's been the people for me, and I think, you know, the supervisors or the mentors who've become colleagues and friends, and the collaborators nationally or internationally that you would not have otherwise met if you weren't in this field, and who've actually become very meaningful relationships in the long term that I think will have a lifelong impact. And for me, that's been a real gift. That's outside of the work and outside of the publications and outside of the grants. It's been finding your tribe and having people that you share, you know, the successes are great, but also the disappointments and the rejections and, you know, trying to maintain your motivation. I think at different stages of your career that you sometimes have the fire in your belly, you sometimes feel like you're in a bit of a rut, and I think, you know, and I can see that for different colleagues or mentors at different stages of their career as well. And so I think being able to talk about that with each other and finding that shared desire to do something fun and interesting and useful has been a real plus for me.
Right. Danny, what's the best part of your career?
Yeah, exactly the same thing, trying to find the questions that really spark your interest in translational research into obstetrics, and knowing that we're a little bit of a rare beast, and knowing that that's okay. And I did not think, if you'd asked me 20 years ago where I would be today, I'm here. That's completely different to what I imagined my life to be, but I don't regret a moment of it, as challenging as it is and will continue to be.
So we've heard quite a lot about mentors today. Can you tell us a little bit about the mentors you've had, and more particularly, you know, how they were able to enable you, or what are the attributes that you really look for in a mentor or value in a mentor?
I think the aspects of mentors that have been successful, those mentee-mentor, I mean, I've been a mentor myself to mentees, and myself as a mentee, to the people that you can completely be vulnerable in front of. So you can walk into their office and you can burst into tears, and you are not judged for bursting into tears, and it's okay that they hold you in that space where you just go, I'm not doing this anymore, or that was really crappy, or whatever it is. And as a clinician researcher, you seem to, or I have, you find mentors from different areas. So I've got my clinical mentors, where you can call them when it's been a terrible outcome or situation, or you're just trying to grapple with supporting yourself through your clinical career. And then you've got your academic mentors that you can go and go, I'm pissing in the wind, I can't do this, I've been told I'm not good enough, you know, I came from a public school, I'm not meant to be here, tell me that I'm meant to be here, and that they will completely hold you in that space of vulnerability when you're like, it's all over, everything's spiralling, and they are able to kind of help you find your roots again. I think that's
What about, sort of, just makes me think about life mentors? I mean, you mentioned you're a single mum with a child. I mean, there are mentors outside work that are also important. How have you managed that?
I think the mentors are in my life at the moment. So I was raised by a single mum as an only child in public housing, but I was raised by a village. So I had a lot of strong women around me who did completely different things. I said to my mum, oh, I think I want to do medicine, and she said, are you sure? Like, that's a lot of hard work, honey. And I was like, yeah, I'm all good. We're good, mum, we'll get there. And then I had, you know, students at my high school, which was across the road around the girls, who said, oh, you're not smart enough to get into medicine, like, why would you even try? And then I was 17 years old in an undergraduate medical program. So I looked up to those people in my life as mentors to just keep striving for the things that you desire, not knowing anything about medicine. So none of my mentors, I don't have the friends apart from who I made at university who are medical at all in any type of way, shape or form. But I think now, as a mum, the mentors are other mothers. So we kind of go through the rut together and we work it out. And I mean, I did this Women in Leadership course 2 years ago here at the UNSW. And there was this one activity that really struck home to me. And they said, if you didn't have imposter syndrome and thought you could do anything, what would you do tomorrow? Right? And like, where would you envisage yourself in this next little part of your life? And I couldn't answer that question. And then I answered the question, but I had to divide my paper into two pieces. And one was what I would do if I didn't have a child, and the other one was what I would do in my current life situation, which is, like, being a mum is just, for me, the bee's knees. Like, that is just watching this little person and being so proud of the young girl that she is becoming and future adult blows my mind every day. They just impress you. Like, they just get better with time. But I think it's that challenge that you find as a mum and as a parent. I mean, I can't talk, I'm not a dad, but as a mum, to say, who am I going to now put in my camp of support? And they're the other mums. They go, you're doing okay, Danny, like everything's okay, and I'll say the same for them, you know? So I think the people you rely on as for mentors has changed a lot for me, depending on your life stage.
Great, thanks. Darshi, you've mentioned your mentors a bit. Who were they, and what sort of particular attributes did they bring?
So I trained in adult neurology, and the thing that I found was that there weren't many role models for me in adult neurology who were clinician-scientists who I particularly wanted to role model. And for me, that was, you know, it felt like a little bit of a vacuum. And I was talking, and I was very interested in neuroimmunology, and my clinical mentor at the time was the head of department at Westmead Adult Hospital, Inspector Full, and he said, someone called Russell Dale at Children's Hospital, and you know, you should go talk to him because he does a lot of neuroimmunology and he's paediatrics, and get her go and have a chat. So I went and had a conversation with Russell Dale, who's the head of clinical school at Children's Hospital at Westmead, but also has led a large neuroimmunology, neurodevelopment research program for a long time. And I think if I had to find somebody who was a significant mentor that changed my career direction, I would probably say that was Russell. And when you try and think about what it was that he brought to the table, I think for me it was, and maybe this is because you know, the UK system is quite different. There is a pathway for people, clinicians who want to do research-focused career, and they have a different stream. And that doesn't exist in Australia. It exists a little bit more in the US as well. And I think for Russell, he always said, but if you want to do that, you can do that. You know, this is possible, this is done elsewhere in the world, but there are different things you need to do in order to do that. So it was that approach of support, and if you have the capability and the desire, you can do this. And I think I really needed that because everybody else around me was not able to provide that. And I think, and I didn't realise things he had done because he was quite strategic. He said, you should apply for this seed grant now. And I said, sure. And I applied for it, and you get $10,000 and you go, yeah, that's cool, and you pop it on your CV. But now I look back and he's kind of setting up my track record for competitiveness for the postdoc fellowships. I didn't know that when I was doing my PhD. And so I think he was, you know, helping me extend my networks. I mean, I now run a transitional care clinic in Concord Hospital Adult for paediatric neuroimmunology kids who are about, you know, 12, 13 on, coming into the adult services in 4 or 5 years with really complex neuro situation. That's largely because of the network that Russell introduced me to. My research is paediatric and adult neurology, once again, because of that. And then I think he was a wonderful role model for how to do collaborations respectfully and how to be a good human being as well as a stellar researcher. I think that was really important for me. Fabienne Brillo, who's a professor of neuroimmunology at University of Sydney, was my other supervisor. She's a basic scientist, and I think having a basic scientist primary supervisor was incredibly helpful and incredibly important because she taught me a completely different way of thinking. And she showed me a lot of the challenges of basic science research, which I think clinical researchers don't necessarily face. We're protected by the fact that at the end of the day, if everything goes belly up and we get 0 funds for research, we still have a job. And I think that's a privilege that, you know, I never complain too much because I work in a lab where they're basic scientists, where if everything goes belly up, they don't have a job. We think we don't have a job, but actually we do. So I think that was that's an important perspective that's really shaped the way I think about disappointments and rejections as well. And then when I went overseas to the University of Oxford, I worked with Professor Sudarshini, who was at University of Oxford, now Mayo Clinic. And I mean, he's just a rock star. He's about 6 years older than me chronologically, but about 30 years older than me, kind of track record-wise. But it was amazing to see somebody who's just an epitome of clinical and scientific excellence. Also, having a young family, lots of children, and trying to navigate being a present parent with research. And I think what he provided was a different view of doing things, and I think if you can work in different centres, not necessarily internationally, but having exposure to different ways of thinking is really important, because otherwise you end up maybe a bit of a duplicate of a particular individual, and I think it's nice to have those different diverse experiences to learn from. So I think for me, the three of them have been really important role models, and I'm really lucky to have continued my collaborations, research, social contact with them, and I think that that's something that will probably continue for a very long time.
Thanks, and that's an interesting point about other countries doing things differently. We had that discussion at morning tea that in the UK, where I also did some training, there's an academic stream that starts at registrar level, and I think we need to be advocating for that here. And paediatricians, of course, are nice people. We made that point.
Very nice,
we welcome anyone who wants to do clinical research in paediatrics. Yes, Phil, another paediatrician. What do you think are the particular roles or attributes of mentors that you've had?
Yeah, I've had a lot. Almost every senior colleague in my specialty that I've worked with has generously made a contribution to the way I think about what I do. And they've all been different people with different approaches to their careers, and I think that's been the most helpful thing, is to be able to reflect on where you're at relative to the way other people's careers have worked out. Some have made choices I wouldn't make, some have made choices that have then informed the decisions I've made. And it's interesting listening to Darshi, because probably we are in that contrasting camp of somebody who's very research orientated with a clinical practice versus somebody who's very much taken on clinical responsibilities and trying to maintain research within that. So that's definitely the camp I've ended up in, and largely influenced by one particular senior colleague I had who was a clinician, and really his style more than anything else, actually, rather than particular career interests, but more his style of living life. And so I am doing a bit of everything, which is what he had always done in his career, and taking up diverse opportunities and maintaining broad interests, and that's how he's influenced me. I think the other thing is about mentors, and actually the Academy has helped me in this. When I applied for there's an associate membership, and it's a mentoring program, and when I applied for that, the specific thing I wanted was somebody who was completely different to me. So I'm mentored by a guy who's an adult ICU physician, who works at the George, and he's a completely different guy to me, and that's incredibly helpful. And so I would say, in that there's two kinds of mentoring. One is the kind of style, life, kind of career I'd like, versus something you engage in intentionally, particularly to challenge you. And if you want to be challenged, it's good to go with somebody who's very different to you, and who you give permission to then ask you some hard questions. So that's the best thing I'm getting out of this new kind of context, is saying to somebody, I'm not going to take offence, but point out all of the weaknesses, point out all of the flaws. And that can be very constructive. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy sometimes, but that's a constructive, much more, I guess, intentional mentoring approach. And I think both have merits. It's good to have both, actually.
Great. Thanks, Phil. We might start with you again. Insecurity. How do you cope with insecurity? We all suffer grant losses and rejections of paper. I've got a little cartoon I use for the students, you know, don't Snoopy sitting on the mailbox waiting for the letter and, not again, you know, saying, don't let the turkeys get you down. And you've just got to poke your head up and start again. So how do you cope with both insecurity and disappointment?
Look, I mean, why would you do research in some ways? Because I think the truth is, in research, a part of the experience of research is absolutely repetitive failure. I have succeeded in fewer grants than I've applied for. Right, I've had lots of papers rejected. I've tried to do studies that have just flopped. Right, so that's a very important thing to understand about research going in. It is entrepreneurial, it is innovative, and a bit like that in business. If you're not prepared to fail, you probably won't succeed in research. Now, I'm telling you my story, other people will tell you of their strings of successes, but I have absolutely failed more than I've succeeded. But that makes the successes really addictive.
And it would be fair to say that the papers that were rejected have ultimately been...
Yeah, you often find a home, sometimes a disappointing home, dare I say. But, so that's one thing just to really be aware of. You do have to have a bit of a thick skin.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it is. You've got to have a thick skin. How do I deal with insecurity? For me, it's pretty clear that success in research does not equal success in life. Now, maybe that's running against the grain of the academy or something, I don't know. But success in research is not success in life, and it's also very clear to me that we are all more than what we do. And so as a result of that, failure is disappointing, but it's much more important for me to have good personal relationships. It's much more important for me to be doing something that matters, even if I don't get recognition for it. That's much more important than research outcomes. And as a result, you can deal with that. Now that comes from somewhere if you want to talk about that, I can talk about that at lunch with you. But that's how I deal with insecurity. And then I also, wake up in the middle of the night because I haven't done something I needed to do and answer emails sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning. You do that kind of stuff too, but that's mine.
You usually get a response from one of your colleagues.
I know, which is horrifying, isn't it, that we're doing emails at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Darshi, disappointment and insecurity, how do you keep that in perspective?
I think it is repeated. I think you just get a thick skin and you just realise that it's not a reflection of the value of the work sometimes. I think as you do more and more, you also see a lot of it is a little bit of horse trading and who you know and what you know and things like that. And so I think I try to come back to, the value of this particular outcome or this research finding, and how does that, maybe it's not the home you wanted, but it's the home it's got, and that's okay. And that knowledge is still out there and it can be used in a particular way. I think there's a very strong tension between the security of clinical work and the insecurity of research, and I think for me that's been the tricky thing to navigate. It's less tricky now because last year, after 10 years, I got my continuing appointment in the university, which is I've just put in a grant in the last 2 weeks, and compared to my state of mind when I put in a grant 4 years ago, every 4 years you're having this existential crisis about what am I doing, what does it all mean, and so on. And I think that kind of career stability is something that institutions and our government funding schemes need to help provide, because there is very much this thing that if you love research, you're going to do it like a starving artist in a garret type thing, and I think that needs to change a little bit, and you need to be able to say, at least for the next 5 years, I'm going to be okay to do something that matters. So I think the security of clinical work is really helpful. And like I mentioned earlier, I've always had that in the back of my mind, that as long as I'm funded, I'm going to do this as much as I possibly can. If this doesn't work out, I'll find another way. And that's been the only way I've been able to go. And the other thing to deal with insecurities, I think you've got to be flexible. And I think you've got to think of, you know, there are these pathways that are very frequently used, but you should also think about other ways of getting funding and different schemes and different mechanisms, and what is your low-risk, low-cost project, and what is your high-risk, high-cost project, and when can you bring this in, and when do you focus on that? And I think there's a bit of a dynamic about that.
Yes, we were talking about this at Morning Tea as well, that as a clinician you can flux in and out of your clinical practice according to how much research funding you've got. Danny, how do you cope with the insecurity?
Yeah, adding on to what the other two panel members have said is around, you know, your worth is not the number. So we had this discipline meeting just yesterday evening, and of course the research person gets up, and I'm the education person, so I did my presentation. The research person gets up and just puts everybody's publication indexes. I don't think there is any other university that is like UNSW, which is so metricized in a public way. We've got a system called Boris. It makes everyone just die a little bit, and I'm down the bottom of the food chain from a publication perspective, but equally acknowledging then that our specialty, our national journals' impact factors are too. So if you're in a metricized system in a discipline where your journals of publication are difficult to publish in, and we're all encouraged to have honours and ILP students and get, you know, that first author publication in a journal, it's not going to be the big hitting journals, which we can still publish in, but it just seems to take a lot of effort in the particular discipline that I'm in. But I think being a clinician and being an obstetrician, I handle disappointment by going, no one's dying, because people can die and women bleed a lot and there's not 6 litres of blood on the floor, so let's just keep it real. So I think that grounds me. I'm like, oh, well, what are we going to do? We'll apply for the next grant, we'll try our best, we'll put the publication to a different paper, and literally no one's life is in the balance. And so that being the kind of permission to say it's okay if you fail and try again, you're not failing cataclysmically with the death of a person or a woman or a new mum. So that's what keeps it. That keeps me grounded.
What I'd like to do is open up for questions from the audience. We've got about 10 minutes. Has anyone got any questions for any of the panellists? Lena's got a microphone there.
This is a moment of insecurity for all.
Yeah.
So what, perhaps,
no one's dying. It's all good.
We do have a couple of questions left which we haven't dealt with. Maybe we'll just do that. Oh, Louise, always a good question asker.
I think Phil actually said before that one of the issues about why he was programmed to be a researcher and to have an academic focus is because one of the issues is that you learn how to ask questions. So I'm just a bit older than most of the people here, so I have a lot of experience asking questions. I just think it's wonderful hearing your diverse but also similar stories. Can you just reflect a little bit on this next step of how you get students or people working with you, your steps now and having, whether they're advanced trainees, whether they're junior medical officers, whether they're people wanting to do PhDs or masters with you or something. Could you just reflect a little bit on what that's been like as you've gone from being the person who is supervised to the person who is supervising, what that looks like?
I can start. Beginning that supervisory role, again, the little baby of the group here. I think what's really important is that, so I've got now, there's 3 of our advanced trainees that are enrolled in PhDs, and I take on a probably more mentorship role for them, and we have other senior academics supervising them, and I think being honest with them about your own journey, because they've all watched mine and they're like, well, I'm not doing that ever in a million years. And that was the first thing I ever said to someone as well. Like, I was a trainee at St George Hospital. I wasn't a trainee there, but I did a rotation there from the Royal Hospital for Women at Randwick, and managed 2 very complicated, very rare conditions of pregnancy, and got this phone call going, what's your name? Trouble. And they said, oh, Danny. And they're like, Dr. What? And I was like, oh my Lord. And they're like, meet me in my office at 5 p.m. tomorrow. And I'm like, oh, who is this person? I've only been here for 3 weeks. I don't know what's going on. And it was a beautiful Professor Mark Brown, who has done, world famous research in hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. He's a renal physician. He's supervised many PhDs, and I sat in his office, and he said, "Who are you? What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I hell's not don't want to do a PhD. No way." It was the same as you, Phil. I was like, "I'm not doing that." Somehow fell into this pathway, but I think from the student's perspective of the trainees, it's showing them that it's difficult, but showing them that you can get to the end despite the difficulty. Allows them to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and then what that means for your career, and doing it a little bit differently in very surgically based specialties like obstetrics and gynaecology. So I think it's modelling to them that's rough, but it's okay, and that you'll be able to balance it because they're clinicians and they're passionate about their clinical job, and again, the relationships you forge with your basic sciences, and I've got these beautiful colleagues, and obstetrics is the weirdest specialty in that you treat your friends. I don't know the ethics about that, and I don't know why that happens, but the midwives that you work with, the obstetricians that you work with, the scientists that you work with, then go, "Can you deliver my baby?" And you're like, God, this puts me in a really vulnerable position. But those babies were at my graduation for my PhD, and they were my basic science mentors, and they're my friends now. So there's a very weird, warped little world of obstetrics that then happens. So I think it's just modelling them. That it's hard and that it's great at the end.
So for me, I think I guess now I'm about 5 years into having gone from, coming back from Oxford and just being me to having my team now. So, and in that 5 years, because we've put in a grant to write what my team was, and there are about 14 people in my team at the moment, and that's a combination of 2 PhD students, 3 master's students, a science postdoc, a research program coordinator, a few clinical fellows who want to do research projects. And I think for me, it's been an immensely steep learning curve. And part of that has been, I'm so used to just doing my own thing and being supervised, but also being quite autonomous. And just having to worry about what's in front of me. And, when my children were very young, that was a good place to be because I was trying to navigate having baby twins and doing research and doing clinical work and so on. But I think while I was already in Oxford, someone was interested in doing a PhD with me when I came back, and we're having some communications and so on. And I think some of the tricky parts of it have been when my own career is not secure, who am I going to take on? So I had a very awkward conversation with someone who's going to finish his PhD with me now, saying, if I survive the next year, I'd love to take you on as a PhD student, but would you like to wait till I get my grant outcome? So, those are odd things to think about, because how do you plan to supervise someone when you don't know if you've got a job or not? And then I suppose the other aspect of it has been, the other challenging thing for me has been implementing the basic science arm of the program. In a way, clinical research, when the clinical fellows who might be working already and doing research part-time, that's quite organic and easy to fit in, but trying to set up a basic science arm and having postdocs or PhD students who are basic scientists has required a lot more effort, and to try and sustain that and to try and establish that. But once it starts, it kind of takes on a life of its own. The thing that I found really helpful is having co-supervisors, because I'm the primary supervisor, but I've got, significantly less supervision experience than people who are co-supervisors on students' projects. And that has been incredibly helpful, because when things are going well, it's amazing, like everyone's happy, skipping through the field. But when things go badly, it's really helpful to have, or things are difficult, or things don't go according to plan, it's been really helpful having co-supervisors' experience to draw from. But what's also wonderful about it is starting to see the successes of people who have started with you. Someone's gone on to get a really successful fellowship, someone's, a lot of their publications have come out, they've won awards at different conferences that helps their research goals. So that's really exciting as well, because I suppose it's the early part of it for me. It's been kind of 4 years since I started doing that. And so that's really amazing. And then also what blows my mind is how much work gets done by having a team as opposed to doing it all yourself. So you kind of have your team meeting and you see all these things that are simultaneously happening, and that's really exciting because you're so used to doing just the things that you can do yourself. So that's been a process.
Still encouraging students, I guess particularly clinicians, into research.
Yeah, I think we'll always be positive about the opportunities. That's a good, just general atmosphere. Be somebody who's positive about research opportunities. And then I supervise medical students, high degree research students, clinicians who are trying to do a project. So I think the most helpful thing is to really have very explicit upfront conversations around what do you need to get out of this process, and then hopefully stretch people and say what you could get out. And equally, what I'm expecting of you in this process versus what I'd love if you could do. Because it's very easy to supervise extremely capable people. That's easy. Yeah, in fact, Blind Freddie could do that. That's correct. The hard thing is when you've got somebody who is not particularly good at it or has conflicting motivations. That's very difficult. And it's really important that at the start you've talked about what they need to get out of it and what you're going to commit to in terms of meeting that need. And then you're both accountable to that. Whereas I've absolutely had people who've come into my office and said, I'm really keen on research and this is what I want to do. And then I've had the first conversation with them and they've never come back. And I count that as a success actually for them and for me, because it wouldn't have worked. And it's better off not taking on something that's not going to work for both of you than taking it on with all the optimism in the world and then finding that you're in the grind of a terrible supervisory relationship.
Yes, so I think for you as students, or if you're taking students on, bringing people into groups that are functioning well, perhaps a project underway that you can slot into as your first project is really valuable. I'm not very good at keeping to time, but I must say that the university's new guidelines for supervising MD students are absolutely amazing. They've got a deadline every week and it really keeps the supervisors to the deadlines as well. And it's just demonstrated to me how having that sort of timeline, not being rigid about it, but really is really valuable for young students in getting their research completed. Have we got more questions from the audience? Yes.
University studying final year medical student. The general question about organising employment arrangements with universities, what the range of possibilities are in doing that and how easy they are to organise.
I'll throw in, how do you organise an employment opportunity? Unfortunately, there isn't usually, it's not as straightforward as that. Usually there's an opportunity that you take up rather than you get to organise, has been my experience in life. There's lots of opportunities though in universities, right? There's, in the academic world, there's effectively the research pathway, and you usually enter that by doing a high degree by research, which you may or may not get paid to do by getting a scholarship, and then that gives you a track of opportunities in employment. Alternatively, you're going to take on a predominant teaching type role, and again, usually there's a fairly fixed pathway of entry into that and then escalation through that. I think, was it Louise who said earlier, the most important, if you actually want to work for a university, the most important thing to do is talk to a lot of people who work in a university. And yeah, so I'll tell you my story, and actually I think it's a pretty common story, is when as you're getting more senior clinically, go and find your university department and say, how can I help? And they will usually say, that's fantastic, we've got all these things for you to teach in, and that provides you an opportunity to often get what's called a clinical affiliation. The universities have different setups for these. All the universities, you'd like to think it was harmonised, but it's not. But if you're willing to teach and be involved in that clinical academic activity and can get an affiliation which is not paid, that's usually the first step towards the kind of linkage that I'm talking about that might create paid opportunities.
However, many university departments like ours, which is within the Children's Hospital, will have opportunities for junior doctors to apply for, you know, an academic role. And as Phil said, often there's a predominant or a substantial educational component to that initially, but you can do research and education and pursue your clinical training. So they're very good jobs, I think, for junior doctors, graduates who are interested in an academic career. As an intern, you're about to become an intern, you'll find you're very busy, but asking your clinical supervisors, is there a research project that I can be involved in while I'm doing my work? And there are often things going on that they're very happy to have some help with.
And it's around knowing the beast that you want to apply to, right? So knowing that Sydney University is very different to UNSW. I mean, they're all the same but different. And then what specialty area you want to go into. So my job came up because someone took a voluntary redundancy, and that position had been held for 15 years by the same person. And so it's kind of, if you're then known by the discipline, we're not employed by medicine, teaching undergrad med students, we're all employed by our own subspecialty discipline. So it's hard as an intern to know where you might end up. So those conjoint affiliations are important, and then your involvement can be more broad, and you know, it can be around exam, you know, OSCE examinations, it can be around clinical bedside tutorials for junior doctors, or for the junior medical students. You know, there's certainly a gap that we need at UNSW for you to then examine. You don't want the intern examining the final year medical student because you're probably mates and you probably know them. So there's a little bit of a time lag between them wanting you to do those kind of final year examination, OSCE, VIVA type things. But that teaching of the junior medical officers and just being involved, like they've said, introduce yourself, but know that there will be a time lag and it's discipline specific.
Thanks, Daniella. I was just looking at Anushka and Mark and thinking, you know, the big institutes, we've got many medical research institutes. Would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that there are other avenues, non-university avenues. Australia's got very vibrant independent medical research institutes. We work very closely with universities. We're affiliated with universities, and we all have clinical academics who are also at the hospitals. So the pathway to those is through, again, networking with your clinical colleagues, letting your interest known very early around research, and there's plenty of pathways into MRIs.
Yeah, a lot of the MRIs will have open days. Sorry, medical research institutes, mine's independent. But there's many, so you can look up the medical research institutes, and generally they'll have open days when you can go in and mingle. So is Karen, I think House is coming up in a month's time or so, so you can go to those, and we have projects on display and talk to people, but there are good mechanisms to be able to integrate with the scientists and clinicians.
And we have representatives from 2 of our medical research institutes downstairs, so please talk to them at lunchtime. They've given up their Saturday morning and they'd love to chat to you. Okay, so I think we might wrap up now for lunch. Some of you have signed up for the mentorship program. There are a few more spaces left, so please sign up as you go down the stairs. Layla, the timing.
Behind schedule.
Oh, are we?
So no, don't worry about it quickly. We might adjust some of the timings at the start of your mentoring slots, but yeah, there are a few slots available still, so if you want to rush down, you may.
Okay, so we've got an hour. How much do you want us to have for lunch and how much for the mentoring?
We'll start the first mentoring session in probably about 10 minutes. That's
okay.
Right, 10, 15 minutes.
Great.
You guys need some water?
Fantastic.
Yeah, we'll manage.
So what I would like to do is just thank our panellists. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you all.